Hi, welcome to episode 4 of Sor Mind. In this episode, we're going to look at Opus 44, number 3. And like in all of the videos in this series, I'm going to focus on a little bit of technique and also on the harmony and some of the compositional devices in Sor's writing. And the hope is that through examining a lot of his studies in depth, we can better understand tonal harmony on the guitar, which will be useful for you, for anyone playing really any kind of music. So let's get started with this piece. So an ongoing discussion topic of debate perhaps is something like, how much do we realize the notation literally in terms of the harmonic accumulation and overlap of the sound, and versus interpreting it and sort of reading into the mind of the master. So I think we've seen in previous episodes how there's a gray area sometimes where there are places where it's more resonant and maybe just more beautiful to let the sounds overlap. And then there are other cases where it might take away from the melodic character of the voices to allow the overlap, and it might produce harmonic effects that Sor wouldn't have approved of. So in this particular study number 3, Opus 44, I want to explore playing this in a little bit more strict melodic contrapuntal way, which is going to make it harder to play, but it's a great opportunity to develop some of these dampening and left hand sort of cleanliness techniques. So right away in the first measure, let's just dive in and we'll get started on this. So in the first measure, as I maybe mentioned, the piece is in C major. So the first measure is a C major chord. But really we have two melodies. We have a bass melody, and we have an upper voice, the upstemmed voice. So I want to explore playing the upper voice in a strict melodic way, which is going to involve a little extra awareness. When we start, we play C and E together. This is a major third, the root and third of the tonic harmony. When we play the 5th, let's lift our second finger so that this E becomes the G. So take a listen. And then when we play the C, we silence the G somehow. And we'll talk about maybe a couple ways to do that. So the first measure should sound something like this. Instead of sounding like this, like an arpeggiated chord, it's really a melody. Now, you'll notice what I did there. So I'll walk you through this. It's a little meticulous. I promise we won't do this for every note in the piece, but this first measure will illustrate the principle. So we play the two voices together. We play G. We lift the E, the second finger. And then when we play the C, maybe we touch the G string to silence it. So now the timing is a subtle thing. Sometimes lifting the finger creates a sound, you know? And that sound can be masked or hidden to some extent if it's timed with the slightly percussive attack of that upcoming note. So if they happen together, it almost becomes part of the sound of the attack of the next note. Another thing you can do, and this is one of the reasons why I advocate for learning rest stroke, because it's not, the rest stroke has different uses, and one of the uses is dampening, actually. If you play this C with a light rest stroke, you kill two birds with one stone. In other words, you play the note C, but you dampen the G string, and it doesn't require another finger. So that is an option as well. I'll do that a little more subtly. Rest stroke doesn't have to be heavy or loud. If you're very, very relaxed, it can just be a very subtle stroke. Okay, so I said I wouldn't belabor the point, but I did a bit. That principle or this intention should be carried through this whole study, and I'll return to this as we go. But let's turn our mind towards the harmony a little bit. So as I said, the first measure is a C major harmony. And then in bar 2, the harmony is basically G7. The C on the downbeat of bar 2 is a true suspension. It's a 4/3 suspension. When I say true suspension, that's not really a term that's used. I'm saying that because in previous episodes, episodes 1 and 2, I was using the term suspension in more of a loose way. And those of you with a bit more music theory knowledge may have been bothered by that. A real suspension, a suspension that is truly a suspension, is like this one, where the note C at the end of measure 1 carries over into the next measure and becomes a dissonant note with the harmony. So in beat 3 of measure 1, it's the root of the chord, it's not dissonant. But the note is repeated in measure 2, and it's the 4th of the G harmony, and then it's resolving to the 3rd. So we have that tension and release, but it's the way that the note is first consonant and then becomes dissonant that makes it a suspension. We may talk in this episode later about appoggiaturas, and appoggiatura and a suspension are similar but different and distinct concepts, and we'll talk about that as well. Okay, so we're only on measure 2. Let's pick up the pace. You've got a G harmony. There's an F in this bar as well. The interval of a sixth from F. So the whole measure is G7 taken together, but with a suspension. One thing I would say is, just like, we want to align the technique with the style and the harmonic information in the piece. And here we have a slur, and that slur, if done properly, will lend a sense of weight to the dissonant note, to the suspension, the 4th, and then it will de-emphasize or kind of taper down to the 3rd, because mechanically, we're plucking the note with the right hand, and then with the left hand we get a little less usually. However, I do notice, if you've studied a lot of technique and you've looked at a lot of materials on technique, it's often taught that we should pluck the plucking finger of the left hand in a slur should pluck into the adjacent string. Practice this kind of technique where we are going for uniformity so that both notes have equal weight and equal presence. So if we train in that way a lot, our hands can kind of take over our mind and we can play these suspensions. We could even do this, where the suspension is quieter than the resolution, or the resolution's louder, right? Particularly when we play a slur onto an open string from closed to open, like this one. If we pluck in to the adjacent string, it can get a little nasty sounding. So I would recommend in measure 2, come off and do sort of an intentionally, bad slur, not into the adjacent string, and let the da, da, let it sound like a sigh. Now, measure 3 is all C major. And again, it's ingenious, right? Because it looks like just a C major chord on the guitar, but we have counterpoint. We have an upper voice, and we have a lower voice. Do, so, mi, and we have mi, do together. Measure 4. Notice it's a G7 harmony, G7 over B, B, F, G, D, and I'm going to make them bass melodic. So I'm going to lift, once more, measure 4. Now, one technique that's used to create this melodic rather than harmonic interpretation of the voices is I'll sometimes dampen strings with this part of my finger, and this is a good case in point. So I play. Let's walk through this. I play the B and D together. When I play the open G, I lift the B of the second finger. And then when I play the F, I actually touch the open third string, which is ringing, with this part of my finger. So I'm coming in a little bit flatter and at an angle in order to, again, kill two birds with one stone. Get two effects with just one cause. So measure 4, let's hear this. Now, probably I want to draw the ear's attention to this note, sustaining, so play the lower voices a little quieter. Measure 5. Do, mi, so, C major triad in the upper voice, but a sustained E in the lower voice. Measure 6. D minor triad with a third in the bass. Now, measure 7. I use that same dampening technique using the sort of I guess you call it the pad, but this tip segment of my third finger is touching the open G. So measure 7, G7, C major. Now that's a G major, all G major in that measure. Now we're back to measure 9, which same. Now here in measure 10, we have that suspension again, but a little rhythmic variation. And in measure 11, we have a C major, all C major. But notice that there's a 9/8 suspension. So, again, we don't want the resolution to be nasty sounding. So I'm going to play the last beat of measure 10. You might come off that with the pinky, but not really strongly into the first string like that. So here's the pickup to 11. Now measure 12. Again, the bass. T, sol, instead of harmonic. Let's make it melodic. So, measure 12. Let's do pickup to measure 12. Now, what is that D sharp doing in the key of C? I mean, we can call this a G augmented triad, but it's really kind of like a harmonic anticipation. Sorry, a harmonic anticipation, little chromatic leaning into the third of the one chord in bar 13. But in a strict sense, in measure 12, what's happening is we've got a triad, a G triad, in first inversion. And then the fifth is raised, which gives us an augmented sound. And that brings us back to really a C major harmony. So here's the pickup to 12. Notice the bass line. I'll play the pickup actually to 12. So it's 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. Listen for that. Now, measure 13 is essentially C major, but there's a passing tone in the bass. C, D, E, root, passing note, third, and then in upper voice 2, there's the leading tone, and those intervals in beats 2 and 3 taken together, those intervals are sixths. So you'll hear some of the Sor etudes are built exclusively from the interval of a sixth. It's an important thing in this style. It's a very sweet sounding interval, and it outlines the harmony nicely. So if we take the pickup to 12 again, we're going to have sixths here, right here, and then D minor in first inversion. This is a little tricky to say what it is. It's just 2 E's. Little passing motion to G7 with a 9/8 suspension. Actually, here we could call it almost an appoggiatura. Whatever we call it, in measure 15, the note A is a non-chord tone. So if you call the whole measure G7, we'll call that note a non-chord tone. But you could say that in measure 15, we have D minor, which becomes G, which becomes C. So does it sound like this? I think it does. So that's a classic 2-5-1 progression, really. We've got D minor in measure 15, then we've got G, or the notes important to G, the root and the third, and then a C major triad, right? Now, as the music is more melodic, I'm trying to play more with a melodic fingering, but here, maybe it sounds nice to let that all resonate as a chord. It's up to you. Okay, in measure 17, we're seeing a theme develop here. Sor likes to establish the tonic, eventually cadence to the tonic, and then in the second half of the piece, often you're starting on the dominant. And in this piece, like in the others, as you scan forward here, you'll notice that the only accidentals, I think I'm not, well, for the most part, the prominent accidental would be F sharp. And that's because we've really kind of modulated to a sense of, we've changed keys to a sense of being in the dominant key now. Everything up to this point, for the most part, was just diatonic C major information. We did have the little augmented motion that involved a D sharp, but for the most part, C major. Now we're in the second half and opening kind of with a sense of G major. So here's measure 17. That's all G major triad, right? The third and the fifth, and then the root. C major, descending bass to, this is interesting. This is another suspension. We've got a complex thing happening here in measure 19. This is a D7 harmony over F sharp, so it's first inversion. And that first note, E, is a 9/8 suspension on the D7 harmony. So we know it's a suspension. It was a note that was present in the previous measure, but it was part of C major. So it was a consonant, it was a third. And then here, it becomes dissonant. And this one, going into measure 20, is a true appoggiatura. So finally, let's define what that is. As I said in previous statements here, or maybe previous episodes, the suspension is prepared. So there's a note that's consonant with the given harmony, and then the harmony changes, but that note continues, and as it continues, it's dissonant for a moment, and then it resolves downward to chord tone. We see that in measure 18 and 19 with the E. But here, A to measure 20, if I saw that in isolation, I might say, well, it's a suspension on the G chord, but the way that it's approached, not by being prepared in the way of a suspension, but as a leap from A to G, from A to C, makes it an appoggiatura. So the difference between the two has to do with the preparation. Whereas a suspension would sound like, if we had a suspension, it would be, but the appoggiatura. So in summary, bars 19 and 20, again, we have a secondary dominant, the 5 of 5, D7, with that suspension. Then we have a G harmony in measure 20, but treated with an appoggiatura. Both measures 19 and 20 have a dissonance on the downbeat, and we can respect the style a bit by leaning on that dissonance and then coming off a little bit, bringing the weight off of the resolution a little bit. So let's see, I think I'll play from 17 actually. Let's hear what that whole thing sounds like. A little less talking. So I carried on to the next bit. We in measure 21, we have a nice melodic design with those leaps, but it's just a G major chord. It's a G major over B. If you play this G chord, right? From Pink Floyd songs or Oasis or something, Led Zeppelin, the chord tones are being treated melodically. And so I might dampen in the ways we discussed. Now, here we have a tied note, and again, it's a suspension. The G in measure 21, the high G, is the root of the chord, so it's consonant. But when the harmony changes to what I would call, I think I would call this D7. You could maybe call it F sharp diminished, but whether we analyze that as D7 over C or F sharp diminished over C, the note G is a dissonance, and it's resolving to a consonant note, the F sharp. Let's call this harmony F sharp. We could call it F sharp minor 7 flat 5, like a half diminished. I think that makes sense. So if we look at, we haven't talked about minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished harmony. F sharp, A, C, E is F sharp half diminished. And that's a secondary function. This is why the discussion of secondary function and secondary dominant is had. The chord that is borrowed or tonicizes makes the sense that the G chord, the 5 chord of the key, is the tonic. The chord that precedes that is not always a dominant harmony. It could be a diminished harmony, for example, or in this case, a half diminished. So we're getting into the woods a little bit harmonically, but just look at the beats 2 and 3, that descending arpeggio in measure 22. We have F sharp, E, C, A. If we organize that, if we stack that in thirds, the harmony would be F sharp, A, C, and E. This is the minor 7 flat 5 or half diminished chord from the key of G, which is our dominant. So this is a secondary function. It's leading us to the dominant, but kind of borrowed from the key of the dominant. Okay. G major, then take a listen. That's a descending D7 arpeggio. And then we're at G. Or we feel like we're home, we're at G though. So that's the dominant of the key. I think maybe it's good to play from 21. Take a listen to this. we're turning. This is kind of pivot. This note is a pivot back to the real key of the piece, which is C major. And this information is the same as before. This is new. Let's look at measure 30. I want to call that D minor or F major. If we call it F major, it's the 4 chord. Little scale run. In measure 31, G7, C in first inversion, C major. Measure 32, we're back to G. Okay, we're getting on the home stretch here. 33 is going to be C major. Suspension. Suspension. Here's our augmented G chord, augmented 5. Sixths moving up to for a moment, let's look at measure 38. Let's go ahead and just call this F major. So, and the reason I'm doing that is that the non-chord tones are on weak beats, if we think that way. So we have, this is really the harmony, F major, but we have passing note, passing note, passing note, and then this is in measure 39, we can call that a D minor chord. And the approach to that is an appoggiatura. The last note of measure 38 is E. We go up a third. We have a 4-3 suspension on D minor. Then the harmony changes to G major, and then we're back to C major. So it's kind of a 2-5-1. 5, 2, 5. All right, this one's going a bit long, so I probably won't perform the whole piece, but I would like to say just a few things in summary. The new information here in this video had to do with the distinction between a suspension and an appoggiatura. The suspension is prepared, so we hear the note in a consonant context, and then often on the downbeat where the note becomes dissonant, the harmony changes, the note becomes dissonant, and then it resolves. So that preparation gives us the definition of a true or real suspension. The appoggiatura is basically the same thing, except that the note that precedes the dissonant note would be a step, usually a step away, like a third away or a sixth away, and we saw some examples of that. So the distinction between suspension and appoggiatura is part of this video. And then we saw another kind of a clarifying idea or concept, which is the idea of having the secondary dominant in the case of like D7 going to G7 going to C. D7 is that secondary dominant. But if we had a chord, a similar related chord like F sharp half diminished or minor 7 flat 5, we couldn't really call that a dominant chord. So in that case, we call it a secondary function. All of these things, we're just kind of touching the tip of the iceberg in these lessons, but I hope that some of this terminology would inspire you to do a little research. And I think a good place to start is Wikipedia. Search things like secondary dominant, secondary function, suspension, appoggiatura, and read a little bit more. And then I think you'll start to understand not only the surface level of the music, but as you start to understand these non-harmonic tones and then these different modulations and things, you'll see how the music is built on the skeletal triad often, and then these other harmonic devices are what give it the sophistication and the eloquence that is such a part of Sor's music. From a technical standpoint, we talked a lot in this video about, and in the previous one too, about dampening techniques in both hands, and the building your tool set so that you can play both harmonic fingerings and melodic fingerings, and you can decide how much resonance, how much overlap, how much harmonic accumulation you want to present as you're playing these different textures that Sor wrote. And that's kind of a personal and maybe ultimately kind of intuitive thing. You might not think about it so much after a while, but you'll hear things that are uncharacteristic of the style, certain overlapping things that are harmonically weird, if you build this awareness. So, well, thanks very much. I hope you're enjoying this series, and please subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. We're going to go into Opus 44, number 4 in episode 5. Thanks a lot.